Welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hammi. Joining us today is Bill Hartung. He is a distinguished expert on the military industrial complex and its far-reaching consequences. Bill is affiliated with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the Cost of War Project at Brown University. Many of you might not know this, but he's also a hilarious stand-up comic in New York City. Check out his stand-ups on YouTube at Bill Hartung or William Hartung. Bill, you have been documenting the cost of war in Gaza since October 7th. And I'm wondering if you can begin today by giving us an analysis that highlights the vast direct and indirect cost of the genocide in Gaza since October 7th.
Well, we did an analysis with cost of war about the cost to U.S. taxpayers, which of course is not the most important cost, but it hadn't been discussed or a number hadn't been put on it. And we found about $22 billion spent since October 7th, either on military aid or expanded U.S. military presence in the region, the missile war with the Houthis. And this is no doubt conservative. First of all, the war goes on. Second of all, it's expanded to Lebanon. There's been attempts to pull the U.S. into some sort of war with Iran. And the U.S. government has been quite secretive about all that's going into this. So we dug through the available documents. But for example, it was found that the U.S. had made 100 arms deals with Israel that were below the level that had to be reported to Congress. So they were purposely trying to keep Congress in the dark. I think because, rhetoric aside, somewhere they understand that they're supporting war crimes and genocide, that this is not a normal arms relationship. But to the extent that they can de-emphasize the amounts of U.S. weapons and how they're being used, they can sort of pretend that they're pressuring Netanyahu, when in fact, the best pressure would be to stop the arms flows.
Can you say more about this relationship? You mentioned how this is not a normal relationship. Can you say more about that and the types of weapons that are flowing there and the cost to American taxpayers?
Well, my colleague Stephen Semler, who worked on the paper, went back, and in the history of the relationship, the U.S. has given $250 billion in military aid to Israel, going back to almost the beginning, which is a huge sum. And it means not only does Israel have U.S. planes, U.S. bombs, U.S. missiles, but also that they've used U.S. money to build up their own weapons industry. So in a quote unquote normal year, the U.S. would be giving Israel about 3.8 billion in military aid. In the less than a year since the beginning of the Gaza war, it was 22 billion. So, about 4 or 5 times as much, and most of it going straight into the war effort. There was a Reuters analysis that said essentially the U.S. has replaced every bomb and missile that Israel has used in Gaza. So basically, they couldn't wage this war on this scale without U.S. support. And likewise, they certainly couldn't escalate into Lebanon and other parts of the region. And I think the thing that's shocking about it is not just the money, but that the Biden administration really has made no serious attempt to try to stop this. They've had rhetoric, they've had meetings, but as long as the U.S. is financing the war and providing the bombs, there's no excuse. And they had this exercise where they were going to try to determine whether Israel was blocking humanitarian aid or using U.S. Weapons in violation of international law. That was a sham. I mean, given that Israel has leveled Gaza, killed 40,000 people with U.S. weapons, there's nothing to research. It's obvious that the U.S. is, enabling war crimes, and some would say genocide in Gaza. So all this kind of, shadow play in Washington about how they're trying to, get Netanyahu to rein it in is belied by the fact of just the arms flow.
Mm. And one thing that we hear constantly from the Israelis, especially even when Netanyahu came to our Congress, is that we as Americans benefit from this, funding this, supporting this, giving diplomatic cover. Could you give us your insights on how we may or may not benefit from everything that's going on over there and our unconditional support for it?
Well, there's this kind of mythology going back a while that says Israel's an important strategic partner because it's the only democracy in the region. Of course, it's not a democracy with the Palestinians under occupation. And in the few cases where Israel might have joined the United States in some sort of conflict, they were asked to stand down, like in the 91 Gulf War. It was felt that Israel being involved would break the coalition with other Arab countries. So the idea that there's this strategic connection doesn't hold up. I mean, there is Israel certainly provides intelligence to the U.S., but a lot of that intelligence is not used for positive reasons. So I think it really comes back to this notion of Israel as a sanctuary
Mm.
for Jewish people around the world in the wake of the Holocaust. And that's a longer term uh, fight, but um, no way can it possibly justify the current levels of slaughter in Gaza. There's no way to really connect the two. And, the fact that the administration has done so little to rein that in is just essentially that the U.S. government and the U.S. companies are enablers of these crimes.
And who benefits from these crimes?
Well, there's U.S. companies, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Palantir, which has been a big cheerleader for the war. They even held their board meeting there after the Gaza war started to show support for Israel and try to get other companies to do the same. But they provide uh, software that's used for targeting, and it's helped Israel to step up the number of targets it can hit in a given length of time. So it's very directly involved in increasing the pace of the slaughter. So there's a whole range of U.S. companies, but the big ones are Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, some of the tech firms like Palantir. Um, and this for them is kind of icing on the cake because the Pentagon budget is going to nearly $1 trillion a year, including probably half of it for contractors. So this is kind of free money because it's government money. They get a high profit margin, but they would frankly still be making money hand over fist even if they weren't supporting the killing in Israel. But their kind of notion is the more the better. Every unit's got to do well. Wall Street, if they have a slump in sales, is going to downgrade them. So it's kind of this voracious appetite for selling weapons that ends up in the kind of tragedy we're seeing now.
And it's in a sense this revolving door where the more tragedy that exists all around the world, the more wars there exist, the more these companies benefit because they're not making the weapons for it to sit around in the warehouses. They have to be delivered somewhere, or tested somewhere, or used somewhere. Um, and in a sense, yeah, I want to. You also wrote an article on the militarization of universities, connecting the lack of divestment and also connecting the relationship between the Pentagon, the weapons industries, and American universities. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about the growing or already existing relationship between American universities and weapons manufacturing companies.
Yes, this has been elevated because of the student ceasefire movement, beginning with looking at how the universities and their portfolios related to the killing in Gaza. But a number of the groups have looked more broadly at all the different military connections to their universities. And basically, there's been an upsurge because the new generation of weapons, AI enabled and pilotless and so forth, have more complex software and kind of scientific research behind them. So the Pentagon is more interested in university researchers who are more adept at this kind of research than, say, somebody at Lockheed Martin. So there's been a surge, probably the biggest one since the Vietnam War. And there's places like University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M, Johns Hopkins, MIT, that are engaged in this research. But also there's a push to get money into historically black colleges like Howard University, University of Indiana. Um, there's universities large and small across the country that get this money. Sometimes the students are not aware of it. Even at Hopkins, which gets $1 billion a year, their physics lab is about 40 miles from campus, kind of out of sight, out of mind. Berkeley helps manage a nuclear weapons laboratory, which I think most students there are not aware of. But this is changing. There's a group called Dissenters, which is kind of a youth anti-militarism group on campuses, which did a webinar with a group called Little Sis about how to research all the military connections of university. There's even people digging back to things that were done in the 60s, researching places like Columbia University. So this is becoming better understood. I talked to a student at University of Indiana who had been suspended for work on Palestine and Gaza. And their research found that there's a large naval warfare center in southern Indiana, employs 3,600 people, makes artillery shells, and the university faculty are cycling in and out of that facility, doing partnership projects. There's investment on campus, so they've started a parallel to their movement on Gaza to break those connections with that military research firm. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch, as the Gaza ceasefire movement looks at divestment. Can they take on the research element, which is more central to running the war machine, but also harder to eradicate because it creates significant revenue and jobs on the campuses around the country.
Yeah, and that article when I was reading it raises an interesting dichotomy where in American media and news, it seems like all of the doxing, sending militarized police forces on 17, 18, 19-year-old kids on American college campuses and maiming and beating up our own children on American college campuses for protesting the war and asking for a ceasefire. On the media, it's usually framed as uh, quelling or preventing hate crimes or anti-Semitism or connecting it to bringing peace to the campus or violations of campus rules. But reading that article, it makes us wonder if this is essentially about profit and about maintaining uh, the hegemony of the country as it is, because essentially we rely on this research, we rely on the connections between universities and um, the weapons industries to keep building these things. And we also rely on the money. John Hopkins, I read somewhere in your piece was like something around $10 billion that they received recently. And I'm not sure their student tuition is raising that much money relative to what they get from the Pentagon or any other thing they're affiliated with. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that. The motive for sort of the brutal form of repression that we've seen over the past year on these college campuses.
Yeah, there's this idea that campuses are supposed to be laboratories of democracy, places for debate and discussion, and the treatment of the ceasefire movement is quite the opposite of that. I think if you wrote on a piece of paper what these universities are doing without telling you who was doing it, they would assume it was some sort of autocratic regime because it's profoundly anti-democratic. And I think part of it is, people lobbying for uncritical support of Israel. There was a few billionaires who basically told Columbia, if you don't crack down on these students, we're going to withdraw our grants. But then standing behind that is the fact that they're pillars in the larger military industrial complex. And those are questions that universities would rather not have to answer. So there's kind of two parts to it. And the other thing is a lot of engineering students feel conflicted because some of the best paying jobs or, some of the easiest jobs available are in the weapons industry. Um, some of them just kind of say, well, it's a good job, they go for it. Some of it do it understanding they're deeply conflicted about contributing to weapons production. And then another group refuses to work in the industry, but it circumscribes their possibilities because the military piece is such a large part of the puzzle, and of course these companies do a lot of recruiting on campuses. Some of them even have something called Lockheed Martin days where they'll fly a military helicopter onto the, campus green, and they'll do all kinds of, activities with the students and, job offers and so forth. So, it's a feeder for the arms industry and also for the kind of R&D the government wants to do on military issues. So, were it to become a big public issue, it would very much change people's view of what American universities are up to. I think at
Yeah.
this point, the larger universities are more businesses than they are educational institutions.
I'm wondering if it's the same in other countries, or is this a uniquely American issue? Like, because to maintain the military status and the level of hegemony that exists, in one sense, the American military industrial complex relies on this. And I'm wondering if this is a particularly American issue or if other countries or um, rivals of the United States are engaging in the same sort of behavior.
I don't think to the same degree. I think countries that rely heavily on weapons, France, UK, uh, it probably comes up similarly. Russia, China, it may come from the top, from the government itself, rather than being mediated through universities. But in the U.S. case, because the universities are so integral to the next generation weapons, I think they're kind of a node in the efforts to, eliminate free speech and freedom of assembly related to these issues, and it really kind of lifts the veil. That I'm a alum from Columbia, and I get all the communications from the officials, and one of them said, "Well, we've solved the problem of integrating free speech with people's feelings about these issues, which is to just have the free speech occur in another location, meaning not on campus."
Right.
So essentially, they're creating these non-free speech zones, and in the Columbia case, uh, most of the time you can't even get on campus without an ID. So it's this very restricted
Yeah.
kind of setup, which is not conducive to the idea of a university as a place of inquiry.
As a New Yorker, I've definitely seen that on your campus. Before, you used to be able to walk through the main street, which is basically a public road, but now all of those streets are barricaded. And yeah, the campus is, as an Israeli scholar that I was speaking to put it at one of the events that Columbia hosted recently, um, he said, I know what checkpoints look like because I'm from Israel. And what I see at Columbia are checkpoints. And that was
Well,
really
it's sort of like they're trying to protect the campus from the dangerous notion of free speech.
right,
I mean, there's nobody threatening the campuses other than raising important issues.
right. And to wrap us up, you wrote another article on the revolving door in the arms industry and how retired military generals, officials go straight into working for these industries. I'm wondering if you can connect the dots for us and bring back the thread around like what we're talking about from the sort of hawkish foreign policy that we see to people who used to be executing those policies now coming back and working in these industries.
Yeah, well, as a exercise, I looked at four, 3 and 4 star generals and admirals that had retired in the last 5 years. 80% of them went to the weapons industry, either on the boards or as executives or as consultants, and increasingly to Silicon Valley, to venture capital firms that invest in the military. Um, and so, that was one indicator. The other is that the arms industry has 800 lobbyists, many more than there are members of Congress. And most of them have gone through the revolving door from the government into industry. So that means once they're outside, they have special access to their former colleagues to get goodies for their company. But also a lot of times, even before they leave, while they're still in government, they're thinking ahead. Well, if I want to cash in on a job with Lockheed Martin, I better not be too tough on them now while I'm in government. So they're kind of co-opted, and it creates this little bubble, which extends also to think tanks, which get contractor money. So basic questions inside the Washington establishment often don't get asked, like why are we getting close to $1 trillion a year Pentagon budget, or what have we really achieved in the wars of this century, and how can you say um, America is military helps uphold the rules-based international order when you see what's happening in Gaza, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, which is quite the opposite. So, in fact, if you wanted a quote unquote strong America, you would invest in education and health in an open society that was attractive to people around the world. You wouldn't be kind of the fist of repression in so many countries. So, um, I think the revolving door creates part of that uh, kind of structure. And there was a time when retired military people would take stances against the military industrial complex. That there was a thing called the Center for Defense Information, which started during Vietnam. Two retired admirals who were vehemently against intervention, and it still exists in a certain form. But if 80% of the admirals and generals are going to work for industry, there's a very small pool left who might actually be critical of what the government is doing in national security issues. So yeah, I think it falls to average citizens, and also a lot of the colonels and others who've actually fought the wars are much more critical than the higher ups, and they may be and also a base for some of the criticism that should be happening.
Yeah, and this, as someone who lives here as a citizen, it makes me wonder, does all of this make us safer? Because at the end of the day, isn't that what it's about? Does it make us safer and does it make the rest of the world safer? Um, and then, because even with the article that you put out, I saw a report where I think the spokesperson for the Biden White House was denying it. Um, that those
Yeah,
were
that was fascinating. Yeah, because he said it was, apples and oranges, by which he meant some of it was about the paying for the arms, some of it was about the U.S. buildup in the region. But we broke it out. So if he doesn't want to look at it together, he could look at it separately. And then the reporter asked him, well, what is the right number? He said he didn't know.
Hmm.
So either they're not keeping
I-
track or they don't
hmm.
want us to know.
Yeah, yeah. And then lastly, to wrap us up, thank you so much for your insights. In one of your stand-up routines, you say, um, I'm not a comedian, so don't, hold this against me. You say it's my job to make the world a more peaceful place where you can see I'm fucking up royally. Can you say a little bit about that? And as someone in this space trying to promote restraint, trying to promote peace, trying to promote responsible statecraft, are there any hopeful things that you're seeing in the foreign policy space? Because as we look at from our vantage point as outsiders is okay, Gaza is happening, Ukraine is happening, there's tensions over the Pacific and Taiwan, and then Lebanon happened as they try to negotiate a ceasefire. There is a new front in Syria. And then, there is also violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon. So it's like anywhere that we're looking at around the world, there is new tensions, new wars breaking out like here and there. Um, should we be hopeful or should we all think like you're thinking in your stand-up routine that we're fucking up royally?
Yeah, well, it's the stand-up is kind of a parallel universe in the sense of, I'm very much trying to roll back those violent tendencies in the world. But of course, it's not up to one person, it's up to movements, it's up to global. So the idea that, I'm screwing up is a little bit of a, in itself is sort of funny. And then unfortunately, people's steady state is, well, the world's violent, it's going to keep going that way. So it's sort of like I'm this lonely little guy trying to make it happen. And then a lot of the rest of the routine is about how I'm incompetent as a foreign policy expert, which people can relate to, individual self-deprecation more than they can to like big statements about, global policy. But it's kind of was prompted by, I get a lot of that in my serious job. People say, well, Bill, you've been working on this forever. We're not making headway. How do you feel about that? And I guess the way I feel about it is, first of all, it's necessary, no matter where we are at this particular moment. Second of all, there is a movement rising, so it's not just up to me. And thirdly, I think some of the people who are part of this system are going to start looking at the consequences of what they're doing and pulling back into opposition. And if you look at, the traditional peace movement that I've been part of, which tends to be older, whiter, mostly focused on nuclear disarmament, is always saying, well, where are the younger people? How do we work with other movements? But if you actually look at different movements, they're all dealing with militarism in some form. Militarization of the border, militarization of the police, the role of the Pentagon in fostering climate change and supporting oil, producing regimes. So there's already kind of like a shadow peace movement. It's going at different pieces of the system. And so I do believe there's a way to draw some links, not by pulling people off of their primary issues, but by coming together at key moments when we can make a difference. So, as anything in life, there's no guarantees, but I think there's a possibility here that there's a moment. Unfortunately, it's coming on the tail of incredible suffering. In Gaza, for example, if the weapons stopped flowing tomorrow, people would still be dying from starvation, from devastation. There'd be all the psychological damage of seeing your family die in front of you. And of course, rebuilding it is going to be a horrific cost. So it's sort of like, if you're carrying that, do you just let it depress you, or do you use it as a spur to action? And I think that's harder, and part of it has to do with just taking care of ourselves. There's actually people have written books about kind of how to deal with all this horror and kind of, take it in and but kind of put yourself on a constructive path. In a way, it's kind of a second order of, traumatic stress that a soldier would have. It's more psychological, but it's hanging around in the air. And I think for some people it's paralyzing. And then the final thing is that they think the government's kind of rigged. You can't really change it. But there's been many cases where we have. And so, it's a certain amount of hope involved, or faith that we can make a difference. We can turn this around. But although there's no guarantees, it's our best option, because I think, among other things, I think engaging in that struggle actually can be energizing, and it can bring you out from under kind of this kind of cloud of uncertainty and depression that's around. And also, many of the struggles for freedom have had an element of joy to them, like civil rights people being arrested, singing in the jails. I worked with the farm workers unionization movement. They had a whole theater group called Teatro Campesino. You kind of need that, because it could take a while. And so it's got to feel like there's solidarity, there's meaning to carry you forward. And I think that can be missing. I know for parts of my career, my speeches were a bunch of dry statistics about the incredible power of the military industrial complex. And people's response was like, oh God, that is powerful. I could never stop that. I'm going to go to the beach. So I think it's important to build in the stories of where we've made a difference. And those are not going to be in the mainstream media. It's going to be up to us to tell those stories.
Bill, inspiring as always. Thank you so much for joining me on Let's Just Talk. And we look forward to continuing these conversations with you.
Oh yeah, let's definitely talk again. I appreciate this.
Amazing. Thank you so much.